I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
And those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity, leftist politics. I'm Matt Bernico.
And I'm Dean Ditloff.
This week on the show, we got everyone's favorite. He wasn't your favorite, but now he is. Everyone's new favorite Marxist philosopher, Daniel Saunders, who is here with a really cool essay called Ideology, Fetishism, Apophaticism, Marxist Criticism and Christianity. It's a very neat essay that's doing a lot of things in 22 pages, published in New Black Friars. We'll link the essay so you can read it in the show notes. It's such a cool article because it's doing the Marxist Christian thing like we like to do on the show, that's for sure. But also it's asking the question, what if Marx was kind of a religious thinker without being a Christian?
Yeah.
It's a really fascinating take on a lot of things. That's generally very interesting, but then there's so many other ins and outs of this essay that you're gonna love. So I don't know, hang out a minute and listen to Daniel talk about it. Dean, what do you have to say? What's your part in all this?
I'll just say I really like Daniel. I've gotten a chance to work with him on a few different learning projects together and reading a lot of text together, and I really appreciate the way that his mind works and the questions that he's asking. I think he's in top form for sure in this essay. It's really fun. I think Daniel says in the beginning of the chat that a lot of the themes come through from our show too, and that's really neat to kind of see somebody dialoguing with similar thinkers, similar questions and problems. So yeah, if you like the show, I guess Daniel's essay is like the smartest version of what we talk about on here, which I appreciate.
Yeah, it's true. It's got all of our faves in it. Jose Miranda's in there, Marika Rose is in there, Enrique Dussel shows up, Derrida's in there, Marx. Oh my gosh, all of them. Everyone, all of our whole bibliography made it into this one essay. It's great.
That and more.
Yeah, it's true. That and more is right. Before we get there, let me give a quick plug for our own podcast here. On our podcast, I've paid myself $100 to give this advertisement, and here we go. Hey, if you like this podcast, what you should do is go over to patreon.com/themagnificast, and you should subscribe to us on that Patreon page. If you do, at different levels, you get all kinds of different fun little rewards. If you, at sort of the lower levels, you get early episodes whenever we have them, which is, sometimes not. We're busy people, what can I say? But sometimes you get them. It's great. You also can get access to our special Behind the Paywall podcast, The Lock-In, where we talk about current events and answer Reddit questions with our fictional youth group. I mean, or not fictional, if you think about it.
It's going to have an NFT soon, and then it will be real.
That's right. It'll have an NFT soon, and it will be real. You can... Man, if anyone wants to buy an NFT from me, let me know. I don't have one yet, but I could make one up for you. I'll write NFT on a piece of paper and mail it to you for $1 million. Anyways, you can also get an invite to our Discord channel, which is very fun. I don't know. If you were on our Discord channel, you'd already been reading this article from Daniel Saunders. So that's what I can tell you. Anyways, if you can't give us any money, that's totally fine. It's no big deal. We don't blame you. But you could go give us a review on iTunes. That would be really cool. If you give us the big 5 stars that we all love so much, and leave us a little note there. We'd really appreciate it. It helps with the algorithm, or that's what people keep telling me. Who knows? That could all be a lie. It's a lie that makes podcasters talk about Apple Podcasts on their
Probably.
shows. I wouldn't put it past them. Anyways, do all of that. Do one of those things at least. But for now, let's go to Daniel and hear about his essay.
Thanks for coming on the show, Daniel. Daniel's a longtime friend of the show, I guess, and friend off the show. A good person all around. Really grateful that you were able to jump in and chat with us this week. Whenever we have somebody on the show who's written something, we ask them to give an elevator pitch for their project. And Daniel has written this really neat essay about commodity fetishism and Christianity and a lot of other things. So, Daniel, imagine this is a really tall building with a very slow elevator, and tell us what it's all about.
Yeah, thanks, Dean. First, I just got to say that I really appreciate the invite to be on the show, and I guess it's a sort of long-time listener, first-time caller situation. Big fan of everything you guys are doing, and I think as we get into this, we'll see that a lot of what's in this article has a lot to do with the show, and I've been influenced by the show. So appreciate that. So the elevator pitch, I hope it's a very tall building and or a very slow elevator because the pitch is kind of difficult to condense, but there are a lot of different levels here, probably too many, as I realized sort of a couple days before the deadline that this was due for publication, that sort of why am I trying to discuss this problem now? But here is my attempt at sort of outlining the general the flow of the article. So the central sort of theme is Marx's theory of commodity fetishism and money in particular, and how commodity fetishism relates to a discussion of both capitalism and religion, and how they influence one another. So there's two components to this. One is how capitalism is like a religion, but also the flip side is how is religion shaped by capitalism's logic. And something I get into is how religion and different sort of linguistic or symbolic structures take on the sort of meta form of money as this ultimate commodity. And I don't talk about this in the paper, but I was just thinking of what is a sort of concrete example of this. And you guys did a pretty recent episode on commodity fetishism, and I was thinking back to that and sort of how we have all these sort of vague things floating around our everyday world under capitalism: the stock market, commodities for sale, consumerist practices, marketing techniques. And I guess the primary question that commodity fetishism gets at is, are these things actually normal? They appear sort of natural and self-evident in our day-to-day life, but are they normal? Are they just sort of an incidental feature of our economy, or are they profoundly shaping necessities of our political economy? It's not just one part of life that we can sort of separate out, but is this sort of all-encompassing? And so that's kind of the frame of commodity fetishism that I bring to this paper. And taking that even a step further, it's then possible to talk about the divinity of money. And this is not meant merely as a metaphor, but as something that's probably more real and true than most of us might even realize. And so this divinity of money, I'm sure we'll get into a little later, but the sort of way that this works is money as this sort of fetishism is something that masks our social relations in day-to-day life. That, you know, we see the stock market and commodities as real, but we don't see the underlying social conditions as real or existing. So that element of the mask is really important. So that is one major aspect of the paper. And so then bringing in Christianity, I was interested to sort of talk about how is Christianity sort of locked within this logic of money and capitalism, both in how it thinks and how it acts, because it is evident that it is locked into it in some sense. But on the other hand, how might Christianity actually resist that logic of capitalism and money? And there's often a very, I think, simplistic sort of Christian answer to this, and I know we'll talk about this later, which is just to sort of kind of throw up theology or the gospel message as the answer. And by simply restating doctrine, we can somehow get out of this bind. And in this way, Christianity becomes this sort of separated off or immune element of capitalistic life, and this, what I sort of like to call it, the mere Christianity mode. But that's actually not the case. I think it's Christianity is incredibly bound up with these things, and so I think the lens of commodity fetishism can help us get to how that operates. And so the paper asks, sort of taking this Marxist standpoint, can we come to a better understanding of Christianity's complicity in a capitalist logic, while also recognizing the ultimate command of Jesus that you cannot serve mammon? And sort of one of the ways that I do that later on in the paper is to bring in this idea of the apophatic, apophaticism, referring to this tradition of negative theology, just meaning that this sort of theology that focuses on what can't be said about God, or that denies this sort of anything of essence in the divine. And I try to use that as a way to kind of link this Marxist and Christian way of looking at capitalism by thinking through how the apophatic might actually help us take off that mask of the fetish. And so I talk about anti-fetishism as being sort of this the ultimate way to be a Christian, I guess. And I think the sort of reason why this is all important is that when we exist under commodity fetishism and capitalism, we're existing as alienated, right, from other people, from our own labor. And so we're sort of, there's this Marxist line, tradition of alienation that talks about humans being made into things. And I think that has a lot of resonances with what the gospel has to say. And so ultimately, all these things converge on this question of how do we describe alienation? And the flip side of that is how do we then overcome alienation? What does a non-alienated world look like? And how can Christianity and Marxism work together to sort of help us get there? That's the pitch. We're there.
Yeah, it's a good pitch. Cool. That very tall building. It's a great pitch. We've got to the top floor, and it's all good. This sounds like the paper I read for sure. Um, well, yeah, like you said, I mean, I want to talk about a lot of these big ideas, but before we get to them, maybe we can kind of do some of the scaffolding here to set up the article for the listeners who haven't read it. Just like you mentioned Christianity's complicity with commodity fetishism, or I'm sorry, you mentioned Christianity's complicity with capitalism, and maybe you could talk about that a little bit more. Like, what does that mean, sort of materially? And then, like, how does commodity fetishism play into the Christianity? Like, I guess, how are these things really working out in the world?
Yeah, there's a lot of scaffolding, so I will attempt to give a fuller picture. But yeah, I'm really interested in if I can maybe take one or two steps back, but to set up why this idea of fetishism is important, because it's pretty abstract when you're just kind of hearing it and thinking about it. But I was really struck by the way in which this particular thinker, Etienne Balibar, uses or talks about fetishism. Balibar is a French Marxist and was a student of Louis Althusser's, who I know you guys have talked about on this podcast. But I was really interested in he talks about the development of Marx's thought from his early writings, which have a lot to do with this notion of ideology. And as he goes on in later works like in Capital, um, the theory of ideology kind of transforms into this theory of fetishism. And that was really intriguing to me because um, they're obviously kind of both essential critical frameworks, but they're kind of like talking about these two very different things. And the way that Balabar describes it is ideology is sort of within this locked in the order of belief, and how if you think about it as like the division of class society, and how the state operates in these ways of controlling classes. So it's like this vertical dimension, but the fetish kind of transposes that into this horizontal dimension, where he talks about the order of perception. So I was really interested in exploring that shift, and I totally lost the thread of your question. So I will punt it back to you, I guess, to redirect me.
No, I think you're doing great. You're doing a great job. I guess like I don't know. Maybe you can say something though. Like how does Christianity like tie into commodity fetishism? Like is Christianity a logic that creates commodity fetishism, or is it the other way around? I guess how are these two ideas sort of linked together?
So yeah, to go back to this idea of how Christianity relates to commodity fetishism. So I was really interested to follow sort of the minutia of how Marx in Capital talks about how fetishism comes out of commodity exchange. And like I said, you guys did that episode on commodity fetishism, so I think people have sort of a general idea of how that works with the difference between use value and exchange value and all of that. But what Marx's argument sort of centers on is that the fetishism of commodities is this expression of alienation in the form of money. So as you sort of separate out use value and exchange value, money is sort of this thing that comes out of those two things as being this universal equivalent that connects all different commodities. And that this universal equivalent is this abstract mediating factor that interlocks with everything else. And money is the sort of symbol of this universal abstraction. And what I was interested in is kind of taking that movement into this universal equivalent and rule by abstraction, and bringing in a couple of other authors to think about how that universal equivalent kind of starts to influence all these other different spheres. So that is where you get this that's where Christianity comes in, I guess, because going back to what I said about the sort of that horizontal sphere, everything sort of in that horizontal sphere gets brought into that universal equivalent, including Christianity. So then it's sort of possible to talk about how Christianity gets shaped by the rule of money, essentially.
No, I think it makes a lot of sense though, because I mean, like when you put it that way, and you're kind of pairing the ideas of Christianity and money through the lens of commodity fetishism. I don't know. Money just takes on this extremely religious, like, and theological character that I don't think I would have really recognized had you not drawn it out the way that you did. I mean, money is this, like, as the universal mediator that sort of draws all these different factors in, like, social structures like Christianity or whatever else. it is like a weird Tower of Babel kind of moment, right? Where it's like this big thing that it takes in everything. It can kind of translate everything to one another. I think it's yeah. I mean, you're right. It makes a lot of sense though to look at it through that lens of sort of a religious structure, even though it's something that we think of as sort of uncaring and secular. It's theological. I think
Yeah,
when you really think
and
about it.
I guess this is also a good point to make, which is that it seems like a lot of the time Christians and a lot of other people would want to talk about money as this sort of incidental thing, as if it's something that can be sort of bracketed off um, with regard to the economy, and whether that means sort of like in Christian terms, like how we can sort of live apart from capitalism, or even sort of in a more sort of like uh, political reformist way of like thinking about how we can, you know, sort of shape the economy to do these different things. Or modern monetary theory was an example I was thinking of sort of how can we um, doctor money to sort of fit the ends that we want. And I guess this line of pursuit within Marx really drives home this idea that um, we actually can't extract ourselves that easily from these questions because it's so pervasive um, in that sense, and it's pervasive because it's rooted in these social relations, right? It's this hidden realm, you know, behind Marx's line that it's that the barrier upon which says no entry except on business. You know, it's this hidden, masked, secret realm, but it's the real world. That's the world that we're living.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And well, that kind of it's the real world thing. I mean, it links the ideology and fetishism stuff that you were saying get parsed out differently in Marx over time in a way that I think is really useful. I want to ask you some more questions about Christianity and Marxist dialogue in a minute, but I feel like it's natural to ask you a question about idolatry at this point. You know, you turn to the apophatic tradition in an interesting way to critique fetishism. The way you're talking now kind of sets money up, as you're saying, as this kind of a divinity, this thing that draws stuff into itself. I think like a lot of Christians, you know, even if they do talk about money as a kind of neutral thing, but you could convince maybe the more progressive ones to be like, yeah, it has this idolatrous hold over us. But there's, you know, more than one way to talk about idolatry under capitalism, maybe more and less productive ones. So what do you think a Marxist approach gives people that, like, I don't know, just a theological response to this is idolatry doesn't, or maybe even like a romantic approach doesn't give you that same kind of critical edge? What does Marxism do to bring that idolatry critique out?
Yeah, that's a good question. The first thing I would say, I guess, about the sort of idolatry question, that's one of the things I was very interested in pursuing was within Balabar's argument of this shift from ideology to fetishism, because even the terms themselves hint at something different that's going on. Because ideology and the idol is sort of about this kind of like illusory, sort of dreamlike image or realm. You know, that's this inverted sort of um, heavenly realm that's inverted from the earthly realm. But fetishism literally comes from a word that means to make or to fashion. So it's bound up in the material world and in how we interact with one another. And so I think that first of all is an interesting component to that I think often doesn't get its due in these sorts of conversations. Um, but to your question about what does the Marxist approach give us that a theological or even like romantic approach doesn't? Um, I think this is a really good question because this is sort of a very powerful, I guess, rhetorical component in this conversation, the romantic approach. And by that I mean this idea that like we can return to like a better time, or a better tradition or of labor practices, or we can sort of will ourselves into this into sort of these pre-modern values. And there's a lot that I have sympathy with a lot of those kinds of arguments, but um, it doesn't really get at what is going on with this question of fetishism, because what those lines of approach tend to miss, I think, is this question of how under capitalism we are living in this masked world of social relations, and that the uh, the root of all productive labor is under that mask. And labor here is not just work or toil, but it encompasses all of humanity's efforts. It's the connective tissue between people and nature. So it's all these really big questions, and money is like inextricably tied with those two. So money is not just some bad thing that's sort of separated off, but it's inextricably tied to these processes.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, that's what I find so useful about the way that you put it together in the article is that there's something. Well, this is what Marx is always going on and on about, and something you opened up with. The question of commodity fetishism is like you look around and everything seems like it's normal, or it appears as normal, but actually it's all extremely weird and like not necessary. And the way in which that it's weird, or the way in which it appears necessary, or goes together or something, is so hard to get your head around. It's like being a fish and figuring out what water is or something. And the idea that you can kind of use Marx's tools to figure out the specific qualities of money and the specific ways in which it, captivates our attention or captivates our relationships, I think is a really strong thing to sort of keep parsing out in a way that Marx does in a particular kind of sense.
Yeah, I guess one thing I sort of wanted to mention too, maybe this was from earlier, but that I think one of the benefits to this approach is that it kind of controversially depicts Marx as a religious thinker. And there's kind of some crazy stuff that you can get into with this. One of the texts that I read for this article was this book by Jose Miranda, the liberation theologian, called Marx Against the Marxists, but in Spanish it's called El Cristianismo de Marx, and he basically tries to argue that Marx was a secret Christian. And I don't think you have to go that far necessarily, but but the question of what kind of analysis is in Capital, the work, at least in the early chapters, and to conceive of it as, I guess, like a religious critique, I think brings all this out in really interesting ways. Because of course you have all these references to kind of the sacramental qualities of commodities and the theological niceties, but it's interesting to sort of think, are these really metaphors, or are they something more pervasive? And so I think we, considering Marx as a religious thinker, sort of in regards to the capitalist economy, helps us to center, what is the true nature of money?
Yeah, that's a really interesting way to put it. Thinking about Marx as a religious thinker. I mean, maybe not a
Yeah.
secret Christian. That probably is going too far for a lot of reasons. But also, that's I mean, so characteristic of Jose Miranda, always kind of taking things maybe a little bit further than they need to go. He's great though. No shade for sure. But yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I don't know why. You're kind of talking through Marx is a sort of like religious thinker, and there is something like there is a sort of sense of idol smashing and like anti-fetishism within Christianity. I mean, you kind of mentioned it as such, and that's what Marx is doing here. Is you can see some kind of similarities. I was thinking about all of those I don't know, all these like weird moments in the New Testament where where the apostles or whoever are like working out whether or not they can eat unclean meats and stuff, and like God has to tell them like it's okay now, you can do this, no big deal. Here's a weird vision about it falling from heaven. It's like sort of like this like sort of smashing of old taboos or something, and maybe there's like a sort of resonance with what Marx is doing in that sense. There's like this a Christian anti-idolatry, not even getting caught up in the and all of the rules of it all or something. But I think it's a really interesting way to put Marx and frame him as a religious type of thinker. Um, on all of those like weird threads I just kind of threw out there, maybe we can talk about the Marxism and Christianity a little bit more outright. Something that your article does is that it does kind of put a little bit more gas in the engine of the Marxist Christian dialogue that has definitely fallen out of academic favor since, I guess, the Cold War is over and whatnot. But some people are still very invested in it, like us particularly. But yeah, I mean, like, what do you think are some of the main barriers and opportunities of that Marxist Christian dialogue as it may exist or, not exist right now?
Yeah, I think there are both opportunities and barriers. In terms of the opportunities, it's not a new dialogue. It's a dialogue that's as old as Marxism itself. One of the things I talk about early on in this article is how the critique of ideology comes out of Marxist critique of Feuerbach and has all sorts of things to do with Christianity. So that ties into sort of seeing Marx as this, idol smashing sort of critical religious thinker that I think is really interesting. What you just said about the Cold War, it's, the world is significantly different. I think we're not beholden to a lot of these dualisms anymore. So things are a lot freer to sort of come together in different ways and pursue different ideas. The opportunity for Christians, I think, is getting a solid theoretical and scientific basis for ideas about economy and money, because as we know, there's this sort of prophetic strain within a lot of left Christianity that can be very rhetorically persuasive, but often doesn't have that tie into sort of these very material things. So I think I would hope that this kind of dialogue would be able to push Christians in that way. Sometimes I find it trickier to answer the question of what can Marxists get from Christians. But I think as I was thinking about what is the question of fetishism and what is anti-fetishism, there's something there, I think, because this Christian propensity to anti-fetishism kind of has this, there's an eye out for false gods, which are often invisible to a lot of people. And one of the themes I keep trying to come back to in this paper is if the capitalist world is a religious world, then who is able to see it as a religious world as such? And I think Christians with the sort of this anti-fetishistic lens can do that even in places where even some Marxists might not be able to. And so there's this chance for a lot of interpenetration of concepts and frameworks, and even words like alienation and presence can be kind of taken by both sides and reworked in these new ways. So I think that's the opportunities I see is that sort of dialectical coming together to create new ways of looking at these problems. As far as the barriers, I think they're pretty straightforward. It seems all too easy sometimes, just to do a really basic kind of Venn diagram comparison of, how does Christianity does this, Marxism does that, here's how they come together. Great, and so there's maybe a tendency to kind of just leave it at this kind of sort of overlap or comparison level and not do anything with it. And then, of course, there's the temptation for kind of a vulgar reading on both a Marxist and Christian sides that, Christianity is only a fetish, or Marxism is only this atheist sort of worldview. But, I think one of the things this paper tries to do is to say that actually both sides are much more complex than that.
Yeah, I really empathize with what you said. It's hard to see what Marxists can gain from Christianity exactly. I feel that for sure. I mean, it's such a funny thing because, like, there are Christians who do critique, like sort of political economy critique, like theologically without Marxism. And it's like, oh, capitalism is a religion, it has its own liturgy, and like the answer to that is just to do our liturgy more and louder, and like like without the actual like Marxist lens of understanding the political economy and knowing like kind of like what to do about it, it is such a hopelessly silly thing to be
Yeah.
very invested in. So yeah, like you said, maybe a dialectical approach is good, but I'm all about this dialectical approach that's very heavy on the Marxist side, not so much on the Christian side. Just like a little bit, like 1 part Christianity, 2 parts Marxism or something in that dialectic.
Yeah, I have I guess, a brief anecdote that might illustrate this. When this paper was being reviewed by the journal, um, there was it was a blind review, but there was a Marxist reviewer and a Christian reviewer, I guess. And the Marxist guy was like, "This is all great, I don't know anything about Christianity, so but this part's great." And then the other reviewer was like, "I don't know anything about the Marxist part, but the Christianity part needs a lot of work." And I was like, yeah, I mean, sometimes it really does feel like you're trying to shoehorn in something, something into uh, a framework that maybe doesn't need it. But I think, um, I am a Christian, and there's no way that I can't be a Christian. So that's like something that I have to do for myself anyway. That's just like, what does my faith have to do with this? And um, this idea of anti-fetishism, I think, is a pretty interesting one for me.
Kind of getting more into that question of Christianity a little more directly, the way that you work out and distinguish a Christianity that bolsters capitalism and a Christianity that unites with Marxism to work against capitalism is something we talk about on the show thematically, obviously, quite a bit. But one of the difficult things about that is it runs counter to a rhetoric you find on progressive and left Christians that people use, successfully and compellingly to condemn capitalism. And it's a problem that Matt and I are always complaining about and trying to figure out off the air. And I think that you do a great job sorting it out in your essay. So curious to hear you talk more about it. On the one hand, I think that analysis is right? Like, there's something about finding Christianity as a counter logic that really works rhetorically. But on the other hand, Christians on the left still rely on the assumption that their Christianity is the true Christianity, and you just like we were just saying, you have to just get that piece right, and the rest will kind of fall into place. What do you think about that disconnect? I mean, how can we maybe have a more ambiguous or nuanced approach to Christianity that can sort out our complicity and our resistance and all that kind of mess?
Yeah, that is the question. It seems like, yeah, I was very conscious when I was writing this and making that distinction, that to try to make sure that it didn't sound like this spectrum of good Christianity and bad Christianity, and that we can easily separate ourselves off into one or the other. It's kind of a framing that I borrowed from Miranda, and he uses it kind of very specifically in Marx Against the Marxists. An authentic Christianity, he says, is that Christianity that sort of sees and accepts the social and political implications of the gospel at all times, and that whatever's not authentic Christianity is one that says, that doesn't make any sense. either defers it or dodges the question. And so that was a really interesting way of framing it that I thought kind of avoids this kind of moral spectrum, I guess, of neatly separating off the good and the bad. And so rather than it being a spectrum, I was trying to conceive of it as this kind of simultaneous reservoir to and kind of impetus to both at either, to either mode at any one time. Are we either, like, in any given circumstance, we have the propensity to act sort of in one or the other mode, as an authentic Christian or as a non-authentic Christian. And so thinking about it in ways that ties it directly to the social and political implications of the gospel. And when I was thinking about it that way, it just made me, like, this is kind of like the disciples. They're kind of these guys who are running around and always sometimes doing the right thing, but often not. And so I think it's like empathizing with them, sort of seeing that this is an always present sort of choice that we have to make. And so yeah, so I think if we, there's a tendency to want to kind of prioritize a prophetic rhetoric on the left in Christian spheres, but if it's not tied to that kind of material and political dimension of the liberation of the poor and standing with the oppressed, that it kind of gets hollowed out in that sense. And this is why I think the Marxist critique of religion is good and should be kind of taken in stride by Christians, I guess, because it forces us to see that religion is not a separate sphere, but it's bound up in the social world, which is kind of, one of the great Marxist insights about life and society, I guess, is that the social kind of takes on this objective dimension. And so, nothing is separated out from that social dimension. And so we can never get too comfortable with a kind of like superior Christianity, that we could never kind of stoop to certain levels or something like that. But we have to have the humility, I guess, to apply that critical lens to ourselves. And so one of the other thinkers that I brought in this paper, Enrique Dussel, who's another liberation theologian, I really like the way he framed it, because he calls this, rather than conceiving it as a return to some kind of true, pure source, it's remembering the urgency of this commandment to, you have the responsibility to the poor. And so that's like this always present sort of reminder, I guess, that we need to return to this, the essential call of the gospel.
Yeah, it's a really interesting way to put it. I mean, it does help. Like, okay, I mean, the difficulty, I think, is clear, because it's not just a problem with like theology or something, or even with like historical theology or even history or whatever. It's a problem of like the organizing capacity of Christianity for doing that work. Like progressive Christians like sort of like need some way to I mean, I guess kind of like what you're saying with Dussel is remind people of that urgency. And I guess it's just like really interesting to find a way to do that without without falling back on the all too familiar tropes of evangelical Christianity, or I guess like just sort of just regular Christianity, I guess, that positions itself as like the one sort of right way to think about God or the gospel or Jesus or something. So it's cool to hear you work that out in a different way that preserves some of the power of the gospel, or that organizing capacity from Christianity. It's really good. Something that I'm sure I'll keep thinking about forever. Sort of like a little bit of a switch in the conversation, but I think it's really fascinating. Not only are you drawing in all of these like really fascinating liberation theologians and Marxist philosophers, but also you're pulling in some of the postmodern faves. you got a little bit of Derrida in there, and that's great. A lot of Marxists and people on the left, I think, like to criticize and shun postmodern philosophy because it's like I don't know, it's too idealistic or whatever. There's all kinds of different critiques that Marxists make of postmodernism. But I mean, the official position of Magnificast is that postmodern philosophy is usually pretty good, as long as it's good for subverting capitalism. But I think your essay is a really good example of like why that criticism, that sort of like straightforward criticism of postmodern philosophy being bad, is a bad criticism. So yeah, I don't know. Like, what do you think of that discourse at large? Do you want to talk about Derrida and maybe like the place that his work takes in your essay?
Yeah. It's funny. I did not want to engage with Derrida. um, but yeah,
Nobody does.
it was kind of compelled to, and this is something I've just noticed a lot about my reading and writing. Is I always sort of end up with these weird, incomprehensible French postmodernists, and I never really know what to do with them, but they always just come back there, and so um, yeah, they're yeah. I mean, hauntology
Haunting you.
was uh, a major theme in how I was using Derrida, but yeah, I think specifically in sort of this paper, and one of the things we haven't really talked about yet was the usage of the apophatic tradition, but it was important to bring sort of the postmodern discourse in with regard to that, because um, if the very at the very least, because that tradition has made a lot of use of the apophatic as a concept, and this is where Marika Rose's book Theology of Failure was really helpful in working through those. But yeah, I mean, Derrida was sort of kind of a key component in going back to something I mentioned at the beginning, this sort of um, the logic of how out of commodity fetishism, this idea of a universal equivalent, this sort of abstract thing, comes to be separated out from that and kind of encompasses everything in that. And so there's this element of questioning that sort of essence that is really key to a lot of this work. And it's also really concerned with language in the sphere of the symbolic. It's really easy in Marxism to talk about the material and the economic base, which is, primarily the most important. But with some of these authors, there's this very intriguing extrapolation that the world of the symbolic, language, and sort of the interconnections between the social kind of takes on its own materiality, I guess. It constitutes its own sort of objective world. And so one of the things I was trying to do in this paper is to kind of reason out how does that material or economic shape that symbolic world. So I think there's definitely maybe a danger in putting too much stock in some of that analysis, but it can be helpful to the extent that it kind of rearranges or shifts things to where you can kind of come at something from a different angle. And another one of the postmodern French guys I used in this article, Jean-Joseph Gou, who does this crazy thing where he brings together Marx and Freud and extrapolates on this idea of the universal equivalent as kind of being this the ultimate sort of element of alienation in all these different ways. And so, yeah, there's definitely something really useful about that. But just to go a little bit farther in Derrida, his book Spectres of Marx was really important for this paper because he talks about idolatry and commodity fetishism. And he's also makes this really intriguing point that in Capital and in the critique of commodity fetishism, the religious analogy of commodities is really the only possible analogy, because it sets itself up as this sort of ghostly specter of material conditions. And so he has a lot that's really great to say about that. And what I found it really interesting to think about in connection with Christianity was like that the fetish then becomes this kind of parody of incarnation or presence, that it's this like, it is a body, but it's like a ghostly body. It's like this, Marx's word is sensuous suprasensibility or something like that. Like it's both a bodily form, but it's not actually existing. And that is taken as sort of this like, as this picture of how alienation works under capitalism, that we are not fully sort of embodied, present people in our social relationships, but that we interact through this really alienating universal equivalent. So yeah, there's I found a lot of use out of them, out of Derrida in particular for this paper, but I kind of never know what to do with a lot of the postmodern thinkers that I read. But I think it's, yeah, I mean, it's there's always enough for me anyway of kind of shifting the framework a little bit to kind of reinvigorate Marxism.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I don't think any of us really know what to do with them, but they are there for whatever reason. And I think the reason I bring up the Derrida piece, and it's great to hear you talking about it, is I think that's where a lot of the article really came together for me. I think that's how it really kind of clicked in my brain. With the most complicated French philosopher. That's why it makes sense to me, I guess. Anyways, I want to read this really quickly because I think it's really a good way to put it. It just kind of encapsulates a lot of what you're saying. So in the essay, you say the commodity exists in an in-between state, both real and not real. For this reason, because it is a false presence, a ghostly form, it transforms human producers into ghosts in a process of reification. So I think this is such a cool observation to draw out, though. So like, good job, I
Thanks.
guess, first of all. But second of all, yeah, it's so cool because I think it kind of demonstrates the perversity of the commodity fetishism, because not only is this sort of like, okay, it's a false presence and you're putting it in a place where you ought not to, right? You're kind of thinking of a thing in sort of like a sacramental way. It's proceeding beyond what it actually is and its use value and its exchange value. And like not only that though, but it also diminishes in some ways like the humanity of the people that create it. So it's like it's a fake thing to begin with, that you're putting in a sacramental place, which is idolatry, right? But it's also doing harm, I think, to the people that are even making it. And I think that's such a profound point that I don't think you couldn't make without Christianity, without Marx, and without Derrida all kind of triangulated here together. I think it ends up being a really, I don't know, the way that you put it here, I think, to me, stresses why commodity fetishism and like understanding the production of things, and wow, this is actually really important. Not only is it a religious problem, it's a material problem, and it's all just really jacked up.
It was really interesting because I didn't really set out when I was writing this to kind of come back to that piece of alienation. That wasn't really in the road plan, I guess, at the beginning, but that's really where it landed, and I found that pretty fascinating. Yeah, so that bit about alienation, it really ties in within the framework of fetishism and this idea of like, yeah, like this masked sort of um, reality that we're not actually living as we ought to, I guess. And um, sort of hitting on that from all these different angles. Another sort of part of that, I guess, was that if the fetish is a world of social masking, then the alternative to that is social transparence. And if maybe I could just read this quote from Capital, which I use in the paper, but this image that Marx gives of a non-alienated society, a society that's not ruled by commodity fetishism in that way that sort of makes people subject to these artificial things, money being the primary one. This is his description of a world where that's not the case. He says, the religious reflections of the real world can, in any case, vanish only when the practical relations of everyday life between others and between humanity and nature generally present themselves to humanity in a transparent and rational form. The veil is not removed from the countenance of the social life process until it becomes production by freely associated producers and stands under their conscious and planned control. And I just thought, that's, to me, that's an image of, social friendship, which is the word that Pope Francis uses in Fratelli Tutti. It's this vision of complete, transparency in relations between people, where no longer are these, sort of alienated, abstracted identities the things that rule us, but that we are actually dependent on others in this very real, embodied way. And that passage is a vision I can get behind as a Christian. So I hope others would feel that way too.
Yeah, well, maybe to bring it home here, we could return to that issue of apophaticism as a way to kind of get there too, because I think you present a compelling case that there is something. You mentioned what can Christianity give to Marxism, and maybe it can't exactly give it apophaticism, but like it could give it something like that, maybe, or at least for Christians who are informed by Marxism. Apophaticism is a really compelling thing in light of your analysis. So, you draw from that tradition. You also draw especially from Marika Rose, who we've had on the show a few times, to kind of articulate that apophaticism. And I like the way that you bring it up as, the apophatic tradition is one that's constantly saying, no, 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 right? Like refusing the names of God, or refusing the kinds of things that we project onto God. I guess the fetishized images of God, really, in a significant way. How do you think there might be a kind of political apophaticism that doesn't sort of, retreat into always just saying, well, we've got the true God over here, so don't worry, we'll solve capitalism. But on the contrary, it's this way of constantly tearing down the divinity of the commodity form, or money, or value under capitalism. How does that apophaticism come together for you?
Yeah, that's pretty good characterization of how it does come together. It's the sort of metaphor I guess I was using in the paper was if Marxism is this sort of critical science of perception, of this penetrating eye that can kind of see beyond that mask or the fetish. That apophaticism in this material or political sense is sort of almost the precondition for that critical seeing, that it does negate, and it does say no, and it does that in reference to that religious world of capitalism. But the key part, I think, for Marx especially, and for the way that I'm using this idea of apophaticism, is that it doesn't stop at that sort of passive or contemplative phase, but it's an active seeing, it's an active perception. And so it must sort of end in this, as apophaticism does. It's not supposed to stop just at a negation, but it's supposed to negate the negation, which is almost exactly this form of Hegelian dialectic that Marx uses all the time. And so we're meant to sort of transcend the limit of this religious world of capitalism, which appears to us as this inescapable world. You can't see beyond it in any way because it's so pervasive. But I was trying to use apophaticism in this way that it's Enrique Dussel calls it, this kind of apophaticism is atheism vis-a-vis that religious system of the fetish. And so it's almost like this precondition of tearing down before we can sort of critically perceive and build up to this next level. And that practical part that I mentioned, it's Dussel says it's you don't do this just to tear down the religion of capitalism. You do it in order to have responsibility to the poor. You do it in order to liberate the oppressed. It's and these things become sort of, it's the same motion of tearing down the fetish, critically perceiving the mask and what it is, and unveiling this world beneath it. These are all the same process and the same motion. And so it's, I toward the end I was like, I don't know if if this can even be called apophaticism anymore, but it's for me it was a useful way to get there from a Christian standpoint of as a way of uniting with this Marxist criticism.
Well, I think it works. I think you pulled it off. It is really fun. There's so much stuff that we didn't get a chance to talk about, a lot that I would love to talk more about. I guess we'll have to find some other way to do that. But it's a great article, and man, I'm just thinking about all these other connections. I encourage people to read it. There's so much happening in it. But that apophaticism piece is always, I don't know, since I read it, it's one I've been thinking more about, not being a theologically minded person myself for the most part. Now I'm kind of finding myself thinking about theological themes. So thank you, Daniel. It's really fun to have you on the show, and we're really grateful to be able to hear a little bit more about the essay. Is there anything you want to plug at the end? Where can people find work that you want them to find, projects you want them to know about, etc.?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter. Not super active there, but that's probably the best place. I am at DoTheDan, DOTHEDAN. It's very stupid, but that's where I am. I've I don't do this for a living. It's not my primary thing, but I've been lucky enough to have these opportunities. So most of what I do will probably be found there. My only plugs at the end are just for Christians not to shy away from the Marxist critique of religion, because it can actually help us be better Christians, I think. Everyone should read Marx. He's not someone you should pass up. He's incredibly dynamic and really able to shift to whatever problems that we're currently facing. And so, not in a very straightforward or sort of doctrinal way, but just in the kind of the way that he thinks can really be useful to whatever we're dealing with. So yeah.
I think you're the first guest we've had at the end who chose to use their plug as a way to plug Karl Marx specifically. So that's fantastic. And I think proof positive that maybe good apophatic Christians are quicker to think of Marx than some of the Marxists that we know. Great to have you, Daniel, and looking forward to talking to you again sometime in the future.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Great to be here.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can do what Matt already told you and go to our Patreon at patreon.com/the Magnificast, where you can support our podcast and find another secret podcast that's very fun and silly and lots of other stuff too. You can, find us on Twitter at The Magnificast. You can email us at themagnificast@gmail.com. We still have a Redbubble store with all kinds of stickers over there if you're into that sort of thing. Our music is by Maria Armstrong, and our outro is by the Illogical Spoon. See you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. Then we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. At least I would've